Welcome to the Vaxa Bureau Intelligence Optimised podcast, where leaders across critical industries get the insights, tools, and connections they need to be ready for today and prepared for tomorrow. As you advance, your standards rise and your community narrows. That's the nature of leadership. Vaxa Bureau exists to support that journey through credible information, secure products, and a critical intelligence hub built for advancing individuals, organisations and the Indo-Pacific. Stay informed, stay operational. The signal starts now. And if you find value here, subscribe, rate the show and share it with someone building the future of critical industry. Aaron, thanks for joining me today, mate. How are you?
I'm very well, Todd. How are you?
Oh, all the better for seeing your smiling face. So, mate, it's been a long time since 1991. You've had an amazing career across defence industry, and you've started your own company in a year tomorrow. Congratulations!
Yeah, thank you, mate. Thank you. Yeah, it's been a hell of a ride this first 12 months. Terrifying and exciting in equal measure.
Yeah, that's great, mate. And you're kicking some great goals. But I was really, really keen to have a chat to you today. Yeah, especially just to dig into your experience in defence and defence industry and security. Mate, what are you seeing at the moment? What are the most pressing vulnerabilities across defence industry right now? So physical, cyber, or workforce related?
I want to preface this whole recording, Todd, with the disclaimer that this is not a defence or a defence industry program bashing exercise, because it may come across at some points that's I'm just having a free kick at people. But what I will say, having been in and around industry for probably the last 25 years, helping to write the current DISP when it was being reviewed and going out to industry in 2018, 2019, there are some big structural problems that still need to be addressed. The DISP folks, to their credit, are doing that to the best extent that they can, I guess. But there's still work to be done because I think from a security perspective, this sector in particular, as opposed to kind of telcos or banks or whatever else, those kind of more heavily regulated sectors, defence industry is not used to being regulated. And so if something's not mandatory, then you don't do it. So what I would say in answer to and that's a very long-winded way of answering your question, but the most pressing vulnerability now is cybersecurity, and by cybersecurity I mean information security. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on in terms of what that means. But generally, the industry is so focused on delivering high quality capability to our warfighters, which is excellent, and that's what they're there to do, that security is seen as maybe a compliance activity, like I tick a few boxes and I'll just get it out of the way. Like a lot of clients come to me and say, hey, I just need to make these problems go away. But what we need to get to is building that more secure mindset, and the Submarine Corporation people are talking about this when they talk about a nuclear stewardship mindset, where security is foremost. Like we talked about with safety as a society, probably in the 2010s when the workplace health and safety legislation was harmonised nationally. Safety was at the forefront of everything we did in workplaces. We need to make security the safety of the 2020s.
And it's interesting. It's especially getting organisations and small businesses, especially, to understand, well, what does that mean? And you touched on, I guess, the cornerstone of everything here around, information and cyber, which, as we said in the beginning of our chat, cyber wasn't a thing when we were young fellows.
No, that's right.
But that opens us up to, a lot of foreign interference and insider threats. Using, with the advent of cyber and the way that we manage information and share information. How does that shape the current security landscape?
Look, I think foreign interference is a factor, and we need to acknowledge that exists. And I'm not going to speak for organisations like ASIO, who do excellent outreach, by the way. So if you're in the defence industrial base and you're not a member or you don't subscribe to the ASIO outreach website or program, I would highly recommend that you do that. So the reporting that comes out of there is first rate, and they've got contact officers in each capital city who are really, really keen to engage with defence industry, not just primes at the SME level, because they need to understand what the kind of threat landscape looks like across the whole of the sector. So they're not looking at primes specifically and then kind of making it up as it goes along for everybody else. But yeah, if you're not involved in the ASIO outreach program, I'd recommend that you do it. That being said, at the kind of SME level, which is where I spend most of my time, where most of my clients are, it's not the center of the universe for much of the industrial base. Insiders, though, yes, absolutely. But what I would say about insider threat is what that conjures up, and I've got a bit of an axe to grind against the term insider threat, but what that term tends to conjure up is that your employees are the enemy and they're going to steal stuff off you, and it's only a matter of time. And look, in some cases there are, as I said, I've been doing this for a while. I've only ever seen 2 cases of malicious insider activity in the, probably 10 plus years I've been working at primes. And then, probably 10 or 15 years before that working in government. So what generally happens from an insider perspective is there are systemic issues that mean people are forced to cut corners from a security perspective because the system is not set up to empower them to do the right thing. Certainly when it comes to data loss and to the point we talked about earlier, Todd, we need to let our staff know that the information we have in an organisation, regardless of what organisation that is of value, because that's what gets you your next job. Now, it's not the defence would have a completely different view on this. Their view would be, well, the information we give you is of paramount importance because it's our information. And defence only looks at risk, through their own lens. The reason companies have got contracts with defence is because they've generated some IP and they've innovated on that, and it's very good. And so the customer thinks, hey, that's great. I'm going to procure that. There's goods or services or whatever else. But if you don't understand what that information is or that proprietary process, and you don't market correctly and you don't put some controls in place, then you don't know, you've kind of lost your crown jewels. So if you do that, then you're on a kind of slippery slope. So as I said, foreign interference, yeah, it's around, maybe not at the SME level. Certainly be aware of it, and get involved with ASIO outreach if you think something's weird. But from an insider threat perspective, I think we need to stop looking at our staff as the enemy and empower them to be your eyes and ears. Because if you're a security officer and you work in a 200-seat business, you cannot be everywhere all the time. So you need to make sure your staff are out there, they know what to look for, and then they report when they see something. And that's generally how we should be dealing in a mature way with the insider threat.
So man, that in my mind would also mean, well, there's more training involved for staff on systems and processes. And, like you said, they're not necessarily the enemy, but they're trying to cut corners perhaps to get the desired outcome for the business. Is it a training thing?
Oh, look, absolutely. Yeah. And I think if you're in the industrial base and you're a member of the industry security program, you've got some mandatory training that you have to deliver to your staff once a year. Very defence focused, not super relevant to industry, because as we talked about before we started recording, Todd, there's not a lot of people with commercial acumen in defence. So they look after things, the way kind of government and public servants do, which is not necessarily bad. It's just the way that it kind of is. My motto for running any kind of awareness training is we need to explain to people why we're doing what we're doing. So it's not the security person or the CEO or whoever stands at the front of a room, shakes the fist and says, thou shalt not. Or otherwise, if you breach this thing, you plug in a USB device, you're going to get a written warning, et cetera, et cetera. That's really not how you get people to do what you want them to do. We explain to people why we're, for example, locking down a facility, or we're saying that you can't take smartwatches and mobile phones at that higher kind of classification end of the spectrum into your normal work area. There's reasons for that, but we have to explain to people why we're making these changes, because what we're seeing in the in a sector. Once upon a time, when I started this in industry, was what the best part of 10 years ago. I was working at Airbus. Pretty much everybody in that workforce there had come out of uniform, so they had a bit of lived experience, for want of a better expression. So they understood why we did certain security things. Like, there's just a reason why that door's locked and I don't have access to it. We're seeing now, because everything's so, software based, we've got a completely different skill set in the sector now than what we used to have probably 10 or 15 years ago. These people don't come out of uniform anymore because the uniform doesn't need them. Like, they've outsourced all that kind of procurement to industry. That means you're dealing with people who are particularly younger generations use their phones all the time. And that's, again, not a bad thing, at the risk of sounding like an old man. But we need to explain to them, okay, sometimes you're not going to be able to bring your phone or your smartwatch or anything else into a work area. And the reason for that is not because the security guy or girl wants to be difficult and wants to make your life a misery. It's because there's a risk of emanation or, information breach or that kind of stuff. And so, to your point, absolutely, we need to train people more, comprehensively. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, we do 5 hours of sort of security training at the start of the year as opposed to 1, because more is not necessarily more. What we need to do is start explaining to our staff why we're doing what we're doing and encourage them to ask questions. That's probably the key takeaways that I deliver in awareness sessions that I do.
I'd love to be part of one of your awareness sessions, mate.
Oh, it's fascinating.
But you've mentioned a really good point. We've gone from, what typically, 10, 20 years ago, guards, guns and gates was what security was about, right? So that physical security. And, there's still an element, well, that's still obviously required along with supply chain and facility security. How are primes and SMEs handling that type of security? Are they at a mature level or are they just ticking boxes?
Look, I think the short answer is that we're still in a really strongly compliance-focused mindset. So, we tick 51 boxes. We're more secure than if we tick 50 boxes on a form, for example. And that comes from the regulator too. So, defence in this case says, do these things to this standard. Away you go. You do them. You either do them or you don't, and you either pass or fail. That kind of stuff. So I think the prime. So that's on the the compliancy type stuff. Facilities security, as you said, Todd, the guns, guards, and gates stuff. I don't see that as being a massive issue certainly not for primes or SMEs for that matter. People tend to know what physical security should look like, even if you don't know what type of lock you need to install or what type of alarm system you need to use, or how often you need to have guards patrolling your facility after hours, that kind of stuff. You kind of get it. Like, you have to do something, and then you'll engage somebody to give you that advice. As I said, primes are doing, and they do this in different ways and to different standards, but primes are certainly leaning into lifting the bar from a security perspective for their suppliers. And two things I'll say on that is the first thing is that that's really good. And I think primes do have a role to play in this. The other thing that I would say is that sometimes it looks like the regulator, in this case defence, is almost outsourcing that uplift and capacity building to the primes rather than providing guidance and expertise and meaningful recommendations to the suppliers themselves. And so that can drive different behaviours. So I really want to see the regulator lean into this. And as I said, they're doing it. They've got workforce challenges. As we know, most of the application processing was done by contractors whose contract was turned off in the middle of the night for various reasons. So they're just getting back up to speed from a workforce perspective. So I think primes and SMEs are doing, primes are doing what they can from a supplier uplift perspective. Facilities we kind of get. It's generally ticking boxes. But what I would say, and I know I talked about this a bit earlier on, is the big problem that I see from a maturity perspective is back to this IP argument. So, this is everybody, like big or small. So my experience in the primes is exactly the same as my experience in SMEs. Everybody has proprietary information or processes or whatever that they generate revenue from. What we tend to see in organisations, big and small, is there's not generally fantastic mechanisms to firstly identify what that is, market correctly, because if you don't market correctly or you can't identify what it is, you can't control where it goes. And if you can't control where it goes, you can't secure the information you've got. And if this is information from which you derive revenue for your business, you can't really secure your business either. So we talk about, and you alluded to this earlier, Todd, that we talk about cybersecurity. Now, cybersecurity means different things to different people because it is a massively broad church. I'm not talking here about really technical stuff because as we both know, that the cybersecurity standard for defence industry has changed, and that's great. That's a step in the right direction. But there are really basic fundamental things that we should be telling our suppliers and participants in the defence industrial base to do from a security perspective that aren't aligned with this framework or twiddle these knobs on in your Microsoft 365 tenancy, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that you touched on it there as well. Defence have a certain standard. Yes, here in Australia especially, and also in the regions with various other organisations, and they've got one perspective, and then industry has a different perspective, and whether you're a small to medium or a prime, it's different again. Do you think Defence's expectations are realistic of their suppliers?
I think short answer, yes. I think, and I know that's going to sound, because it's skewed obviously to more towards in terms of ease of implementation, the prime. So primes can deliver. When contracts change or requirements change, really easy for primes to do that. They go through a contract change proposal process. They get additional funding from their contract manager, and then away they go and implement whatever the change is. And this happens all the time. The problem as it kind of plays out in the SME space is they might not necessarily have contracts yet that they can leverage this proposed contract change against. So if they've got to implement a different cybersecurity framework, for example, and there's a lot of people got caught up in September last year when the standard changed from the top 4 of the Essential 8 to all of the Essential 8 at maturity level 2. As I said, that's not a bad thing. The alignment or the control framework had to change because top 4 is a bit of a joke, as I've said in numerous kind of social media posts and elsewhere. But the problem is, from that perspective, primes are essentially on the hook for the same amount of cost, I guess, as SMEs are, which doesn't necessarily make it an even playing field. There are grants available particularly for the Essential 8 Maturity Level 2 uplift. There are some caveats around that in terms of how to apply, and this has only become apparent or certainly been articulated to us in the last week or so. So if you want a grant as an SME, because you've got to be below 200 seats to qualify for the Defence Industry Development Strategy grants, you have to have applied for DISP membership and get what they call a maturity action plan provided back to you from the DISP cyber team. So if you apply for your grant and you say, when they ask you, what are you doing for Essential 8? And you say, well, I don't have anything. I'm going to do the whole lot. Here's a price that I've gotten from a service provider. Your grant will get rejected because what Defence and what industry wants to do, the Department of Industry wants to see is Defence essentially writes the scope of work for you or the statement of work. Then you go to the market with this maturity action plan. That becomes your scope. That should get priced by your service provider. Then you use that as the basis for your grant. So, yeah, look, it's not even. I think is probably the obvious thing to say, but it needs to be done. And I would argue, as I've said previously, like the framework we've got currently is okay. Like it's a good, kind of anti-ransomware sort of mechanism, but it doesn't do anything about empowering organisations or even kind of forcing organisations to or identify what their crown jewels are. As I said, might be information, might be proprietary processes, and control that information, because if you can't control your information, you're not going to control your customers' information. So, look, we have to pick a framework, I guess. And I've seen some stuff on LinkedIn this morning where Lockheed Martin in the US is mandating the cybersecurity maturity model certification. So you might have heard of CMMC. They're mandating that across their whole supply chain now, which was always going to happen. And I suspect that's going to happen here at some point, particularly if you're doing AUKUS-related work. It's a bit better than what we've currently got because there's some more risk management in there. But bottom line is, look, the standards that SMEs have to meet should be the same as the standards that primes need to meet. Otherwise, if you're a prime and you're bringing someone into your supply chain and they don't have a cyber standard that you know and understand, and they don't have a personnel management kind of system where they do background screening, again, that you understand and are familiar with and can accept the risk of, you're probably not going to engage them as a supplier. So if you're an SME and you're like, I don't really want to do this, then you're probably not going to get much work as we go forward, because the security bar is only going to raise over time.
Yeah, and there's obviously a cost to that, especially for SMEs. You know, all SMEs wanted to play in the supply chain, especially with the primes, for a number of reasons. But I think the primes and also their client, the government, need to be realistic that that changes the price as well, because people are going to start taking shortcuts to go, well, hang on, I've just got to spend $80,000 here to get up to scratch. I know I can do the work. We've got the systems. We need to invest a bit more money. Do I have the cash flow to sustain that? Or maybe not. Maybe that's a question or a conversation that the small to mediums need to have with the primes as well. It's that relationship piece. Because my thought process is that I agree with you. We need everyone in the supply chain needs to meet a standard. There are certain grants, like you said, but I think that it becomes a big impost on small to mediums to maintain those levels of security as well. So it's one thing getting it, but it's a second thing maintaining it, because sometimes you might need to employ an additional person, or potentially, I guess, a contractor to help them with that as well, to maintain that and ensure they're meeting the standards. But there's a cost involved there, and unless you've got that longer term view, to be able to wear that can be a bit overwhelming for small to mediums.
Yeah, look, I 100% agree, Todd. So what the change in the cybersecurity framework in particular has forced people to ask that question those two questions you're asking. First one, do I want to stay in this sector? Like, is this a game I want to play anymore? And if the answer to that first question is yes, then the other question is, well, how do I pay for this, but how do I resource this? So do I insource it? As you said, do you bring in a contractor to manage it, or do you outsource it to a service provider? And then both of those have risk associated with them. Having worked for Australia's biggest sovereign cybersecurity company for the last few years, retaining staff, like qualified, cyber network type people, is really difficult. The market is super competitive, particularly in markets like Brisbane, where you've got ASD and their Red Spice program needs 900 cybersecurity professionals in Brisbane. Now, when they first kicked off, there wasn't 900 cybersecurity professionals in Brisbane, I'd argue, but they're another piranha in the tank for recruitment and retention. So, look, there are ways to meet those requirements, build security into what you do that are not going to break the bank. And what I would say is, be a bit, I won't say clever, but have a think about, if you need to meet standard, like cybersecurity standards in particular for defence, have a think about where those controls need to apply. So do they need to apply across your whole business? If 100% of your revenue comes from defence, then yeah, obviously they do. And we see this pretty much with every client that we deal with now, defence might be anywhere from kind of 10 to 50, 60%. So to reduce your costs and to kind of reduce the annoyance for the rest of your employees too, who run the rest of your commercial operations, you only need to deploy those controls on the defence kind of facing workforce and IT environment. So have a think about where you might creatively apply those controls to minimise your cost as well. So there are ways to do it. You'll see a lot of people advertising, hey, we can do this, we can do this, we do this cyber, et cetera, et cetera. Ask them a couple of quick questions. What's their experience in the sector? How long have they been doing this as a service provider? Just to get a better idea about what they do and what their credentials are, because we've had clients come to us who are like, look, my managed service provider doesn't know what the Essential 8 is, so they've already outsourced their IT and cybersecurity management. But there's a lot of managed service providers who don't know how defence works, what the Essential 8 is. And again, that's not bad. It's just not where they play. Like they play in the more commercial space. So yeah, you can reduce your cost by reducing the scope of your control implementation, certainly from a cyber perspective.
That's great advice. That's it for this episode of the Vaxa Bureau Intelligence Optimised podcast. If you found value here, subscribe, rate the show, and share it with someone building the future of critical industry. The path of leadership may be solitary, but the future of leadership is coactive intelligence. Be ready for today, be prepared for tomorrow.